Guo was never one to follow the crowd. A quiet figure in a world of noise, he spent most of his time buried deep in the inner workings of electrical systems, circuits, and blueprints. While his peers obsessed over flashy projects, he focused on something far more grounded, solving the minutiae of power systems to make them more efficient. To him, every wire had a story, every resistor had a purpose, and every volt carried its own weight. This obsession led him to his work at the Beijing Power Research Institute, a place brimming with bright minds and cutting-edge technology. Guo was just one of many engineers, but unlike the others, he wasn't looking to impress anyone. He wasn't out to become famous. He didn't even care if his name was ever mentioned in the credits of a groundbreaking discovery. He just wanted to understand how things worked, especially when it came to electricity. That day, he was alone in the lab. It was late, too late for anyone to be wandering through the sterile, humming hallways, but Guo couldn't help it. The experiment had to be done now. For the past year, he'd been working on a project he called quantum electric synapse, which, in simple terms, was meant to increase the efficiency of electrical transmissions between devices. But to Guo, it wasn't just about efficiency. It was about the deeper connection, the flow of energy, the intricate dance of electrons moving through wires. What if there was more to it? What if he could tap into that flow directly, not just observe it? He had kept his ideas to himself, fearing that if he shared them with his colleagues, they'd dismiss him as delusional. But tonight, he was ready to test it. His fingers flew over the keyboard, adjusting the parameters on the computer screen in front of him. The large machine that filled the center of the room, his experimental rig, began to hum, its lights flickering to life. The complex wiring, stacked components, and blinking monitors gave off a soft, almost hypnotic glow. Guo stood back, staring at the machine with a mix of excitement and anxiety. "Let's see if it works," he muttered under his breath, tapping a final command into the system. The lights flickered once more, and then everything went dark. For a moment, Guo stood frozen. He had expected the power surge, had even planned for it, but not this. The lab was eerily silent. A cold sweat trickled down his spine as he reached out to check his equipment. His fingers brushed against the surface of the table, and then, he felt it. A pulse, a jolt of energy shot through him, an electric current that surged up his arm, coursing through his body, and into his mind. His vision blurred, his heart raced, and the world around him seemed to warp. He gasped, feeling his thoughts stretch, expand, and then, snap, suddenly, he wasn't in the lab anymore. He was inside the system. The circuitry, once just a network of wires and chips, became a living entity in his mind. He could feel the electrons moving, rushing along their paths, pulsing with life. It was as though his mind was now one with the machine, flowing with it, becoming it. He could feel the current, the flow of energy as it coursed through every component, every wire. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly alien. Guo tried to make sense of it, but it was too much. The energy was overwhelming. He tried to pull back, but he couldn't. The current had him, its grip tightening around his consciousness. For a moment, he feared he might lose himself, swallowed whole by the machine. But just as suddenly as it had taken hold of him, it released him. He stumbled back, gasping for air, his legs shaking beneath him. The lights flickered back on, and the machine settled into its usual hum. Guo looked around the lab, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was back in his body, but something had changed. It was the energy. He could still feel it. "Holy hell," he whispered, stumbling toward the computer screen. His heart was still racing, but his mind was clear, sharp. He felt different. Like something inside him had awoken. As the seconds ticked by, Guo realized what had just happened. He hadn't just connected with the system, he had become part of it. His consciousness had merged with the electrical flow. It was an accident, sure, but it was also an incredible discovery. He had touched something that no one else had ever dreamed of. With trembling hands, he began typing. His thoughts were racing, but he knew what he needed to do. He had to test this. He had to understand it. He reached out again, this time with a more focused intent. His mind pressed forward, searching for another connection, another node to connect with. It was like learning to walk all over again. He stretched his senses, and just as before, he felt it, the surge of energy, the pulse of the current. This time, however, he wasn't pulled into it. He was able to control it. His mind nudged, twisted, and pushed the current, directing it as if it were an extension of his own body. "I can control it," he muttered, a grin creeping onto his face. The ability to control electrical flow was one thing, but what he was feeling now was something far beyond simple power. He wasn't just manipulating machines or circuits, he was interacting with them on a fundamental level. His mind could slip through the wires, hopping from one device to another, following the current like a traveler following a river. For a moment, Guoruoi lost himself in the flow, exploring the vast network of circuits like an adventurer discovering uncharted lands. He jumped between devices, his mind slipping from one power grid to another, from computers to televisions, to security systems. It was like having the entire world at his fingertips. This was no longer just about energy efficiency. This was about control. Guoruoi's newfound ability, however, was not without its risks. The more he experimented with his power, the more his body began to feel the toll. Every time he jumped, every time he connected with a new circuit, it felt like a part of him was being stretched beyond its limits. His body would tremble, his eyes would blur, and the sense of disorientation would grow. It was like being pulled through an electrical current, too fast, too far, but despite the physical strain, Guoruoi couldn't stop. He was hooked. The allure of being able to control the very flow of electricity was too great. He wanted to see how far he could go. How far could he push this? His first real test came a few days later, when he decided to try something a little more daring. He found an old security camera system that was connected to the building's main electrical grid. With a focused breath, he extended his mind toward the nearest outlet and jumped, slipping into the wires, feeling the surge of energy as he connected with the security system. He could see the camera feed in his mind, the security footage flickering before his eyes like a television screen, and then, with a grin, he did something he'd never thought possible. He took control of the cameras, not just the feed, not just the images on the screen, but the cameras themselves. He could move them, twist them, turn them in real time, all with the power of his mind. The implications were staggering, but it wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted to understand the limits of this new power. Guoruoi felt a strange satisfaction as the city's lights flickered in his control. The current pulsed beneath his fingers, his mind guiding its flow through the electrical grid like a conductor orchestrating a symphony. He could feel the power surge, the electricity humming through his fingertips, and the endless possibilities it offered. It wasn't just a matter of turning on or off a light, it was the ability to influence entire systems, to reshape the pulse of the world around him. For the first time in his life, Guoruoi felt truly in command, but with power came responsibility, or, more precisely, a lack of it. He had always been the quiet, methodical engineer, working behind the scenes, but this was something different. This wasn't just about fixing problems or making systems run more efficiently. This was control, raw and unchecked. And as much as he told himself he was merely experimenting, Guoruoi knew he was no longer just an observer in the world of electricity. He was its master. The deeper he delved into his new abilities, the more questions arose. He had become addicted to the sensation, like a drug coursing through his veins. The more he used it, the more he wanted. Guoruoi began to experiment on a grander scale. He connected himself to the global electrical grid, a vast web of power lines that stretched across continents, pulsing with an almost infinite source of energy. The first time he jumped from one grid to another was almost too much to bear. He felt as if he was falling into an abyss, his consciousness shuddering with the force of it. But then, just as quickly, he found his balance. His mind settled into the flow, and suddenly, he was connected to a new city, an entirely new set of wires and machines. It was like stepping into a new world, where every electrical device was a part of the whole. And yet, in this new world, Guorui was the one who had ultimate control. For the next few days, he spent hours experimenting with his newfound power. He accessed satellite systems, hacked into security cameras, manipulated traffic lights, and altered electricity grids. It was like playing a game with the city itself. But even as the excitement of his experiments grew, something darker began to emerge. Guorui was no longer just controlling machines. He was manipulating people, too, indirectly, of course. A flick of a switch, a change in the power flow, and the lights in a hospital would flicker just when critical operations were taking place. A twist in the current, and an air conditioning unit would malfunction in the middle of a heat wave, leaving an entire neighborhood sweltering in the heat. At first, it was just harmless fun, he thought. But then, as he grew bolder, he realized the potential consequences of his actions. One wrong move, and he could cause chaos on a global scale. It wasn't until he stumbled upon a secret transmission that the true scope of his abilities, and the dangers they posed, became clear. He had been toying with the idea of intercepting data streams, mostly just for the thrill of it. One day, while snooping through an encrypted transmission, he caught something he wasn't supposed to see. The message was part of a larger file, encrypted and layered with security measures, but to Guorui's surprise, he had no trouble breaking through. The transmission was a list of names, dates, and transactions, all tied to major energy corporations. The deeper he dug, the more he uncovered, a global network of manipulation, bribery, and shady deals designed to control the world's energy supply. And there was more. A project codenamed Project Blackout was mentioned repeatedly, but the specifics were vague. Whoever was behind it had gone to great lengths to keep it under wraps. Still, Guorui's curiosity got the better of him, and he began to dig deeper. The more he uncovered, the more alarming it became. This wasn't just about money, it was about power. Whoever controlled the world's energy had the power to control governments, markets, and, most disturbingly, entire populations. Guorui's heart raced as he read through the files. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering. These were the kind of secrets that could bring down entire governments, overthrow multinational corporations, and change the course of history. But there was no going back. He had already seen too much. He leaned back in his chair, a cold sweat trickling down his spine. He had been playing with fire, but now, the fire had consumed him. His mind raced. He knew that exposing these secrets would have far-reaching consequences, but he couldn't just walk away. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his abilities were tied to something much bigger than himself. This wasn't just about playing with electrical currents, it was about uncovering a truth that the world needed to know. But the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. The moment he uncovered Project Blackout, Guorui knew he had crossed a line. He was no longer just a curious engineer. He was a threat, one that needed to be silenced. Within hours, a warning appeared on his screen: unauthorized access detected. Security breach imminent. Guorui's heart skipped a beat. He had known the risks, but he hadn't expected the authorities to move so quickly. Someone, somewhere, was already aware of his actions. And that meant only one thing: he was being hunted. The thought barely had time to settle in his mind when the lab's security system began to glitch. The lights flickered once more, and then the entire building went dark. Guorui's mind snapped into overdrive. He had to move fast. His fingers flew over the keyboard, trying to lock down his systems, but it was too late. His heart raced as he disconnected himself from the grid, hoping to cover his tracks. But it was no use. He could feel the weight of the net closing in on him. He had made a grave mistake. Now, he was the one being hunted. A series of alarms began to blare, and Guorui realized he was no longer alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, clad in black tactical gear, moving silently through the darkened hallways. He could hear their footsteps growing louder, closer. They were after him. He didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, Guorui jumped into the electrical grid, his mind leaping from the building's power lines to the city's grid in a desperate attempt to escape. But even as he moved, he knew it wouldn't be enough. They would track him down. They would find him. And when they did, there would be no going back. Guorui's fingers trembled as he jumped again, this time accessing a nearby security system to cover his tracks. But the more he ran, the more disoriented he became. His body felt like it was being torn in two, stretched beyond its limits as he flicked from one electrical grid to another. He could feel his strength waning, the toll of using his powers taking its toll. But he couldn't stop. He had seen too much. He had uncovered too many secrets. And now, the world was coming for him, the chase was on. Guorui's mind raced as he dove deeper into the city's electrical web. He could feel the power coursing through his body, his every thought tethered to the current. It was exhilarating, but also terrifying. He had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. The power was his, but so were the risks that he needed a plan, he needed to think fast. His body ached with the strain of constant jumps, and he could feel the limits of his abilities. Each jump, each connection, drained him further, like a battery slowly losing its charge, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Guorui's sense of time became fragmented. His body, exhausted from the continuous strain of jumping through grids and systems, felt as though it were slipping in and out of focus. Every jump felt more like a desperate gasp for air than the smooth control he once had. But he couldn't stop. His mind was connected to something much bigger now, something too dangerous to ignore. The urgency of it all, the consequences of what he'd learned, the fact that the government was closing in, the threat of what might happen to the world if Project Blackout came to fruition, it all pushed him forward. He couldn't afford to hesitate. As his mind flicked from one power line to another, Guorui realized he was no longer in full control of his jumps. He was slipping. Each time he moved, the sensation of disconnection was more pronounced. His body, tethered to the real world, felt distant, as though he were an observer watching someone else struggle. His consciousness was stretched too thin, pulled across continents in milliseconds, diving between grids that spanned vast regions. A sharp pain pierced his skull, and for a moment, he feared he might lose himself entirely. He tried to pull back, to return to the relative safety of the lab, but the forces at play were too strong, and he couldn't disengage. It was like trying to escape the grip of an ocean wave that had already engulfed you. He thought he heard a voice, distant but clear. It was familiar. Guorui. Lu Fang. The thought hit him like a jolt of electricity. She had been sent to track him down. Lu Fang, the ex-intelligence officer turned cyber hunter, was sharp, dangerously sharp. He had known from the beginning that the authorities would send their best to find him, but the realization that she was now within reach hit him with a sense of finality. She was no mere pawn, she was a force to be reckoned with, and unlike him, she had been trained to outwit even the most sophisticated technologies. In his fragmented state, Guorui could feel her presence, like a shadow lurking just behind the current. She was there, closing in fast. The pulse of energy he felt from her, riding the electrical waves, was unmistakable. She was tracking him, riding the same currents he used to escape. Every time he leapt, every time he jumped, she followed, like a predator anticipating its prey's next move. He gritted his teeth and tried again to pull himself together, but the physical toll was unbearable. His mind surged through the circuits once more, but this time it was a struggle just to maintain focus. As Guorui jumped from one power grid to another, each leap seemed to drain him further, his vision blurring, his consciousness flickering. He could feel the very fabric of his mind beginning to unravel. He had pushed himself too far, and he knew it. But he had no choice. He couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake. His next jump was wild, instinctual, desperate. He had no plan, no sense of direction. He was just trying to outrun Lu Fang, trying to escape the inevitable collision. As his mind crashed into a foreign grid, Guorui felt his vision tunnel, the edges of his awareness narrowing, until finally, he lost all sense of control. For a moment, he couldn't tell if he was still inside the system or if he had fallen completely outside it. He was drowning in a sea of data, unable to distinguish reality from the electric web he had become so entwined in. It was as if his body had ceased to exist altogether. His pulse raced, his mind screamed for clarity, but nothing came. He was slipping through the cracks, slipping into something he couldn't understand. Then, suddenly, a sharp, piercing clarity broke through the fog. Guo blinked, and his surroundings snapped back into focus. He was in the heart of the city, but it wasn't the city he had known. This was something deeper, something more fundamental. The power grid stretched out before him, vast and interconnected, like a neural network. It was alive with electricity, humming with the power of millions of lives. And at its center, he saw it, the core of Project Blackout. His breath caught. He had found it. Project Blackout wasn't just a shadowy initiative hidden in the files of energy corporations. It was real. And it was far worse than he could have imagined. The core was a massive control center, designed not just to manage energy, but to redirect it on a global scale. It could manipulate power systems, creating artificial shortages or surpluses at will. And with it, the world's energy supply could be weaponized, not just for political leverage, but for absolute control over nations, corporations, and populations. This was no mere conspiracy. This was a calculated plan to control the pulse of the planet itself. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about profit. This was about total domination. Guorui's mind reeled as he processed the scope of what he had found. He wasn't just stumbling upon secrets anymore. He was standing at the precipice of a global disaster. The entire system could be manipulated, altered, twisted, used, to control people, countries, economies. And he was the one who had discovered it. A cold wave of realization swept over him. Exposing Project Blackout wasn't just about bringing down a corrupt energy cartel. It was about preventing a global disaster, a catastrophe that could devastate the world's infrastructure. If the wrong people like the ones behind Project Blackout, gained full control, it could mean the end of freedom, the end of choice. And now, Guorui was the only one who knew about it. His thoughts were interrupted by a new, chilling realization. His connection to the power grid was still alive. He was still in it. And worse, he was being watched. Lu Feng. She was closing in. He could feel her presence in the current. She was tracking him, moving swiftly, guided by the same web of electrical power. Guorui had no more time. His body, already on the verge of collapse, was no longer capable of withstanding the strain. His energy was fading, but his mind still burned with the truth he had uncovered. Guorui's options were narrowing. He could try to jump again, to escape, to hide. But the government would find him. They would capture him. And in doing so, they would seal the fate of the project. The people behind Project Blackout wouldn't stop until they silenced him. But what if he could do more than just escape? What if, instead of running, he could strike back? The thought hit him like a jolt. He had the power, the ability to control the flow of energy, to manipulate the world's grids. Why couldn't he use it to expose the truth? To force the world to see what was happening before it was too late? With a sudden surge of energy, Guorui reached deep into the system, pulling at the very heart of Project Blackout. His mind, though weak, found the core and hacked into it, pushing through the digital defenses with everything he had left. The core hummed with life, and then, nothing. For a split second, the system faltered. The electrical current wavered, the power grids flickering in a moment of hesitation, and then, with a final, desperate push, Guorui did what he had been avoiding all along. He pushed the button. The lights went out, the entire world plunged into darkness. For one brief moment, Guorui stood still, his breath shallow, his body trembling. He could feel the weight of the world shifting, the balance tipping in his favor. The blackout wasn't just a technical malfunction. It was a signal. It was his message to the world would now know, and the people behind Project Blackout would have to answer, but Guorui's victory was short-lived. As the last of his energy drained from him, he knew his time was running out. He had exposed the truth, but at what cost? His body was no longer capable of enduring the strain. His mind was fragmented, his connection to the grid slipping away. As his consciousness flickered one last time, Guorui heard the distant hum of a machine, the faint whir of electricity cutting through the silence. And in the distance, just beyond his reach, he saw Lu Fang, but this time, she wasn't chasing him. She was standing still, watching him, waiting.